So I'm going to do something I actually promised myself a while back I wouldn't do, and that is I'm going to respond to a post made by social media LDS apologist Jacob Hansen. And normally I try to avoid these pop apologists because I find them, they rub me the wrong way. Right? If I was somebody who was investigating the church and somebody pointed me towards a Jacob Hansen or a Ward Radio, being a mature, thoughtful adult, this is the kind of thing that would drive me away from the church. But I want to examine what he does here because he goes and he uses previous generations' racist rhetoric against Africans as an example of intellectual and ideological diversity in the church. But he presents the racist teachings as evidence of ideological diversity and not as official church doctrine. So what I'm going to do, we're going to watch the clip, and then I'm going to go through and show you the history behind the attitudes that he's talking about and how his argument is self-defeating because the way he presents it is historically illiterate.
Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but an LDS influencer recently argued that ideological diversity is a cancer.
I sure did.
And I actually think the exact opposite is true. I think ideological diversity is the bedrock of revelation.
Ooh, let's hear it.
As I've studied church history, I've learned that revelation is messy. The restoration has never advanced because everyone agreed. It has advanced because faithful people brought difficult questions to each other and to the Lord.
But why would they take it to the Lord if their diversity of opinion on the matter was their strength? Don't you see the very reason that we seek revelation is so that we can know the truth? And when a collective group of people know what the truth is, there is no longer ideological diversity. For example, not too long ago, we had the opinion that black people were less valiant in the pre-existence. Was it good that we had that variety and diversity of opinion about that matter? Would it be good if we brought back that sort of ideological diversity? Again, the whole point of revelation is to create unity around the truth. So no, ideological diversity is not the bedrock of revelation. It's the problem that revelation seeks to solve. And those who reject the Lord's revelations in favor of an ideological diversity are actually causing division and confusion in the kingdom. And that's why a love of ideological diversity is a cancer.
So that's Jacob Hansen. And when I watched this video, I initially laughed out loud because this is a classic example of someone who is so certain in his conclusion that he never actually stops to reflect and think, is the example I'm using actually valid, or does it blow back on me in some way? It's a common characteristic of many of these pop social media apologists. They are often mistaken, and it's one of these issues where they are so certain that they are often in error but seldom in doubt, okay? The irony of what Hansen lays out here is that he cites historical teachings about people of African descent, and this idea that was taught, it was taught, that they were less valiant in the premortal existence, that is the Mormon understanding of the life before this life. And he cites this as an example of how ideological diversity is a cancer in the church that causes contention and problems. But what Jacob either doesn't know or intentionally does not tell his audience is that these teachings did not originate from some intellectually or ideologically diverse collection of people competing with ideas. The teachings that he cites come directly from the highest levels of church leadership and were taught by the First Presidency, by other people who were sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators for members of the church in that generation, and as such were seen as revelation. They were defended in official correspondence from the First Presidency. These ideas were repeated in general conferences in 1939 all the way up through the 1960s, and they were taught at missionary conferences by general authorities acting in official capacity. These were presented as doctrine for decades, even though now the church has stepped away from it, rightfully so. Ironically, the very example that Hansen uses, in this example that Hansen uses, it is the intellectual diversity of the church membership, not institutional conformity, that ultimately solves the problems of racist teachings. It was faithful scholars, it was historians, it was educators and average members who challenged these racist assumptions over and over and over again over decades, thus creating the conditions that would ultimately lead to the abandonment of the revelatory claims of the previous leaders and cause people after 1978 to adopt a position which is closer to the one advocating by the intellectually diverse voices who were seen as liberal or outside of the orthodoxy. So, let me explain some more. Without looking at the generational racism that came up in the 19th century, I'm going to start in 1939. And the idea that race reflected some premortal valiance was being openly taught in general conferences, specifically by Apostle George F. Richards, who in the 1939 April General Conference declared, "I cannot conceive our Father consigning his children to such a condition as that of the Negro race if they had been valiant in the spirit world in that war in heaven." Okay? That's in conference. By the mid-1940s, some church leaders and faithful members had begun to recognize the serious problem posed by these racial teachings. And as I'll discuss more later, I'm going to touch first on Dr. Lowry Nelson. Okay, Lowry Nelson was an active Latter-day Saint. He was a respected sociologist during his lifetime, and he was also a former mission president. And in addition to that, he was a professor at BYU. So Lowry Nelson, looking at the world around him, drawing upon his experience and observations, writes the First Presidency expressing very specific concern about the impact of the church's racial teachings on missionary work and other issues. And these letters go back and forth for several months, but the First Presidency responded in a full letter with all their signatures on July 17th, 1947. This is that letter here. The letter says, and I quote, "Your position seems to lose sight of the revelations of the Lord touching on the pre-existence of our spirits, the rebellion in heaven, and the doctrine that our birth into this life and the advantages under which we may be born have a relationship to life heretofore." So they're saying our advantages, our birth in this life is tied to our behavior in the previous life. And then they say, "From the days of Joseph Smith, even until now, it has been the doctrine of the church, never questioned by any of the church leaders, that the Negro are not entitled to the full blessings of the gospel." Okay, so right there, they're tying it back to Joseph Smith. And it's never questioned. No church leaders ever questioned this. Then they go on to say, "Furthermore, your ideas, as we understand them, appear to contemplate the intermarriage of the Negro and white races, a concept which has heretofore been most republic to most normal-minded people." So again, they're saying normal-minded people, they're not going to touch the mixture of races because of doctrine, right? And they say, "From the ancient patriarchs until now, God's rule for Israel, his chosen people, has been endogamous." This response is significant for us to keep in mind because it demonstrates that the leaders of the church at that time were not presenting these ideas about valiance in the pre-existence as speculation or personal opinion. They explicitly described them as coming from the days of Joseph Smith and the doctrines of the church. And they appealed to Revelation as their justification. Just 2 years later, in 1947, the First Presidency would go on to reinforce this position even more explicitly in a First Presidency letter again. The August 17th, 1949 letter issued one of the most important official statements of race in church history, even though we do not recognize this now, okay? It says, "The attitude of the church with reference to the Negroes remains as it has always stood. It is not a matter of declaration of a policy, but of direct commandment from the Lord, on which is founded the doctrine of the church from the days of its organization, to the effect that the Negroes may become members of the church, but that they are not entitled to the priesthood at present time. Okay, so that is as solid as you can get. This is revelation. This is from the Lord. This is the doctrine from the foundation on. That statement then goes on to expand upon the theological justification for the restriction, which is valiance in the pre-existence. It is a racial hierarchy like I talked about in a separate video. It says, the position of the church regarding the Negro may be understood when another doctrine of the church is kept in mind, namely, the conduct of spirits in the premortal existence has some determining effect upon the conditions and circumstances under which these spirits take on mortality. Among the handicaps, failure of the right to enjoy immortality, the blessings of the priesthood, is a handicap which spirits are willing to assume in order that they might come to earth. Okay, so he's saying in the pre-existence, people weren't valiant, and they understood that when they came to this to this earthly life, that they would not have access to the priesthood. The letter then goes on to say, under this principle, there is no injustice whatsoever involved in this deprivation as to the holding of the priesthood by Negroes. So they're saying, this is our doctrine. It is our impression, our revelation that individuals were less than valiant in the pre-existence. Therefore, it's not injustice to withhold priesthood from them. This statement is particularly important because it directly contradicts the modern apologetic claim that these ideas were merely personal opinions of individual church leaders, or as Hansen has presented them, as examples of ideological diversity within the membership. The First Presidency explicitly declared that the restriction was not a policy, but rather a direct commandment from the Lord that constituted the doctrine of the Church of Christ. During the decades that followed the 1940s, these teachings spread throughout the church and became deeply embedded in official instruction, all the way to the point that when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, these ideas were still somewhat ubiquitous. They were still taught by the previous generation. They were repeated so frequently that they became commonplace amongst members and leaders alike. One example, which is actually a pretty prominent one, comes from Apostle Alvin R. Dyer, who was teaching a missionary conference in Oslo, Norway in October of 1962. Now, he took it upon himself during this time in his official capacity to teach the following. The reason that spirits are born into Negro bodies is that those spirits rejected the priesthood of God in the pre-existence. This is the reason you have Negroes upon the earth, okay? That was taught at a mission conference to missionaries who would later go back and become leaders in the rising generation. Another prominent example of this teaching appears in the writings of Harold B. Lee in his 1973 book, Decisions for Successful Living, Decisions for Successful Living, which was published while Lee was president of the church. Okay, it says, the privilege of obtaining a mortal body on this earth is so seemingly priceless that those in the spirit world, even though unfaithful or not valiant, were undoubtedly permitted to take mortal bodies, although under the penalty of racial or physical or nationalistic limitations. Now, this quote is important, okay? Because this deserves emphasis. Harold B. Lee was the living prophet at the time this book was published in January of 1973. He would not pass away until December of that year. So consequently, these teachings were never viewed as obsolete. They were never viewed as folklore. They were never viewed as historical curiosities like we would view them now. When this was published, this represented contemporary prophetic teaching of a living prophet only 5 years before the 1978 revelation, which extended the priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy members. Okay? So in 1973, the prophet of the church is saying there are racial limitations because of valiance in the preexistence. And then in 1978, the same God that influences that living prophet influences the living prophet to take the exact opposite position. So, with all of this historical context in mind, let's examine the part of history that Jacob Hansen conveniently overlooks for his very flippant comment here. For decades, church leaders taught that the restrictions placed upon black members were not merely administrative policies, but expressions of divine authority and a racial hierarchy put in place because of valiance, disobedience, or other malfeasance in the preexistence. The First Presidency declared in 1949 that the restriction was not a matter of declaration of policy, but rather represented a direct commandment from God. Okay, that's very hard to get around. And described it as the doctrine of the church. Now, when I was raised, I was told it was never doctrine. So one of my biggest shelf moments was finding out that the First Presidency had defended this doctrine as doctrine, and it wasn't just a generational mistake. I was lied to on this. At the time, though, church leaders sincerely believed that what they were defending was revealed truth. They believed that this was revelation. Yet, the eventual reversal of these same teachings did not occur because of some kind of perfect unity around existing interpretation of revelation. It occurred because faithful members, scholars, educators, and intellectuals in the church, which were much aligned and much attacked during this period of time, challenged the assumptions that had become deeply embedded in the church's culture and the church's theology. Okay? This was not a situation in which Spencer W. Kimball woke up one day and just changed it. If you want a really good understanding, read the book Second Class Saints. It's fantastic. But the work of these individuals created an environment in which difficult questions could be examined. They were raised publicly. They were raised academically. And historical claims could be investigated, which is what Lester Bush did, which I'll talk about here in a second. But the previously accepted explanations had to be reconsidered given the pressure both internally and externally that was raised by people who were intellectually divergent. Together, these efforts generated the pressure that ultimately encouraged the church and its leaders to re-examine the issue leading up to the 1978 reversal of racist policies. So Dr. Lowry Nelson, who I talked about earlier, provides one of the clearest examples because Nelson was not an outsider attacking the church, and he certainly wouldn't represent some ideologically divergent mind. He was an active Latter-day Saint. He was a respected sociologist. He was a BYU professor and a former mission president. And like I said, in 1947, Nelson challenged the First Presidency's racial teachings in a series of letters questioning why people of African descent were less valiant in the premortal existence. Now, in these letters, they run through the whole gamut of issues, and you need to go read them, okay? Not just the quotes, but read the entire letters. Because he was arguing that racial restrictions were incompatible with the principles of the gospel. Now, we know now Lowry Nelson was right and the First Presidency was wrong. The First Presidency responded to this by reaffirming the restriction as the doctrine of the Church of Christ, and that it rested upon the direct commandment from the Lord. When given these responses, most people would shut down and say, okay, that's what the prophet's saying. Nelson, however, refused to retreat. He argued instead that the church's position reflected the racial prejudice of the generations rather than divine revelation. Now, at the time, in the 1940s, many members would have undoubtedly viewed Nelson as someone who was creating an unnecessary cultural controversy. Once the prophets have spoken, the thinking has been done, I think someone said at one point. Yet history has demonstrated that it was Lowry Nelson's moral instincts that were considerably closer to the church's position now than the official teachings that were defended by the First Presidency at the time. So Lowry Nelson represents the first repudiation of the racist teachings in the 1940s that would become the standard for what we have now. Another influential voice in criticism of the church's positions was Dr. Sterling McMurrin. McMurrin was a distinguished philosopher. He was a professor at the University of Utah, and he was a lifelong Latter-day Saint. Though he was threatened with excommunication, it was actually David O. McKay who intervened and stopped him from being excommunicated, because David O. McKay understood where McMurrin was coming from. Although, throughout the Civil Rights era, he publicly criticized the church's racial restrictions and argued that they were inconsistent with both Christian ethics and the fundamental principles of justice. Again, he was right, and the church's position was wrong. The revelatory position was wrong. McMurrin's views attracted criticism from from church leaders, and he even faced the possibility of church discipline, like I said. Nevertheless, his arguments anticipated many of the values that the church itself would later embrace, as we see in the repudiation of the racist policies in the Gospel Topics essays, right? So, and then you have Lester Bush. Lester Bush probably kicked most of this off with a paper he wrote, but Lester Bush made the most significant scholarly contribution to this entire discussion. In 1973, at the same time Harold B. Lee was publishing his book in which he defended racial restrictions, Lester Bush published an essay entitled Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, a Historical Overview in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. In this article, Lester Bush very carefully examined the historical record and was able to demonstrate almost conclusively that many of the widely held assumptions about the priesthood restriction were historically unsupported. Now, mind you, he is saying that there's no historical support for these. At the exact same time, leadership of the church is arguing that this is revelation, this is the doctrine of the church, that the African people were less valiant in the pre-existence. His research challenged the belief that the restriction originated with Joseph Smith, and instead showed that its development was far more historically complex given the influence of social prejudices. And he also pointed out that it was particularly under Brigham Young that these ideas began to metastasize. So Bush's article was remarkable, not because it was an attack on the church, but because it subjected generation-long held assumptions to a very careful historical examination. His scholarship would later force both members and leaders of the church to confront the evidence that many had never seriously considered. And again, if you want to read more about this, Second Class Saints, read it, listen to it. It's on Amazon. Historians now widely regard Bush's work as one of the most important intellectual and social contributions to the church leading up to the 1978 revelation. Another individual that we need to look at here as the ideological or intellectual diversity is Lowell Benyon. Benyon represents another important example of faithful intellectual diversity in the church. Benyon was one of the most respected educators and social ethicists of his time, at least within the church. So throughout his career, he emphasized compassion, human dignity, and the ethical teachings of Christ. Although he often expressed his concerns quietly rather than more confrontationally, like, say, Lester Bush would have, he was a voice that consistently encouraged members to stop and consider and think seriously about the racial injustice and the moral implications of discrimination and how they surfaced and represented in church teachings. His influence helped to shape an entire generation of Latter-day Saints who increasingly found the appeal to racial hierarchy in justifications for racial restrictions to be difficult to reconcile with the rest of the gospel's teachings about the universal worth of all of God's children. Nor, might I say, were these concerns and voices limited to those in academics. There were faithful members, such as Stuart Udall, who publicly criticized the racial restrictions in the church. even though doing so brought criticism from many of the church's leaders, including people like Delbert Stapley, who defended racial hierarchies in the church during his lifetime. The exchanges you have between these voices demonstrate that the debate about the valiance of African people in the pre-existence, or that race was denoted by some sort of religious hierarchy, was never simply between faithful members and enemies of the church, or intellectuals of the church, or those with ideological diversity. Rather, it was a debate amongst faithful Latter-day Saints coming at the same issue from different perspectives on what faithfulness itself required. This history presents a profound irony for Jacob Hansen, because his argument that ideological diversity is a cancer because it causes confusion in the church. That's his word. It is a cancer. And we have revelation because we want truth, but the revelation when it comes to race ended up not being correct. The historical record demonstrates that institutional uniformity preserved unjust doctrines for well over a century because they were attributed to revelation and truth. During that period, prophets, apostles, mission presidents, seminary teachers, institute instructors, and ordinary members largely repeated the same theological assumptions about race because they were bound to ideas of revelation and authority. Unity did not correct the racist errors. Unity preserved it as a problem that hurt generations of people. What ultimately challenged those assumptions was not greater conformity, the idea that once you have revelation, the thinking is over, but a greater diversity of thought. Faithful scholars, historians, educators, and members began asking difficult questions, like the ones that Jacob is responding to in the initial video, and bringing those to leadership. They re-examined the historical evidence, and they challenged the inherited assumptions. Jacob's response to the person he's responding to in this video is historically illiterate, and he should know better. The people in this generation argued that the existing explanations of race failed both historically and morally, and those were tied to revelation and authority and power. Rather than destroying the church, these voices helped create an intellectual and moral environment that made that change possible. The greatest irony of all of this is that the church eventually would move closer to the position advocated by the people who represent the intellectual and ideological diversity. The church has abandoned the hardline positions of its previous leaders, the ones who defended this as doctrine and revelation and from Joseph Smith and a commandment from God in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and almost all the way through the 1970s have been completely subverted for the position held by those who represented the ideological diversity. The 1978 revelation extending priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy male members marked the beginning of that change. Decades later, as we've seen here recently, the church would go even further in its 2013 Gospel Topics essay entitled Race and the Priesthood. Now here, the church explicitly disavowed the theories, and I meant it's not theories, the doctrines and the teachings that black skin represented a divine curse, or that people of African descent were less valiant in the pre-existence, or that racial restrictions and hierarchies reflected God's will or God's disfavor. Those explanations, which had been repeated in general conference, in church leaders, in First Presidency correspondence, in official teachings, in missionary instruction, and in church publications, all were formally rejected, not because of a revealed unity amongst the people and the prophets, but because of a generation of people who came up looking at the problem from different perspectives and challenged publicly and internally the church's position. The modern church's position now aligns with those who raised concern through intellectual and ideological protest. Lowry Nelson, Sterling McMurrin, Lester Bush, Lowell Bill Benyon, Stuart Udall, and many other faithful critics than it ever will again, the official explanations advanced by numerous church leaders throughout the middle decades of the 20th century. This reality This history exposes the historical illiteracy of Jacob Hansen's dogma, okay, his certainty. If ideological diversity is truly a cancer, then one must conclude that the very people who helped expose the church's weakness, its racial teachings, and its racism were themselves a part of the disease. Okay? But historically, the history suggests the exact opposite. They were not undermining truth. They were helping the institution distinguish between inherited racist assumptions and false attributions to divine revelation to support racist ideals and genuine progress and meaning and compassion and inclusion in the church. The deeper issue is not whether or not revelation produces unity. Of course it should. The real question is how a religious community determines whether a particular religious teaching genuinely represents actual revelation, if you believe in revelation, or whether it represents the sincere but mistaken confirmation bias and mistaken human interpretation shaped by cultural inheritance, by cultural assumptions, and cultural biases at the time. If that's the case, everything that comes across as revelation previously can pretty much be dismissed, which is why I have a problem with leaning on it for fact and truth. The history of the church's racial teachings demonstrate that sincere leaders can firmly believe what they are defending as revealed truth. They can have that moment where they believe that God has revealed it to them, that burning in the bosom, whatever, is completely based upon their perspective. And later generations can come to recognize that those interpretations, that revelation, that teaching were incomplete, culturally conditioned, and simply mistaken. And that realization should produce humility on behalf of people who represent the church rather than rigid certainty. So ultimately, rather than viewing intellectual diversity or ideological diversity as a threat, the history of the very case that Jacob cites teaches us that it often serves as an essential safeguard against institutional bias and historical blind spots. It creates a space where assumptions can and should be tested. It creates a space in which evidence can be examined as it should be examined. It challenges long-held beliefs so that they can be measured against both what we know about history and moral principle, away from the cognitive bias of previous generations. Far from being a cancer, Jacob, intellectual and ideological diversity functioned as the church's corrective mechanism. It allowed faithful members to ask difficult questions about ideas that were protected under the guise of revelation. It gave church historians and researchers the opportunity to uncover forgotten evidence. And it gave scholars the opportunity to challenge accepted narratives that ultimately helped prepare the intellectual and spiritual environment in which the church would later abandon its racist policies, its racist teaching, because these were not random teachings that came up from the membership. As I've shown, they came from the top down. You misrepresented them. If the history of the priesthood and the temple restriction and the idea of valiance in the pre-existence teaches us anything, Jacob, it is that the diversity of thought is not the enemy of supposed revelation. Sometimes it is the very means by which a community discovers what it had long assumed was revelation was in fact the product of its own historical moment, its own historical biases, and its own historical defenses of revelation, not because they were thoughtfully thinking through it, but because it protected the institution's position at the time. That's all I've got to say. Jacob, it is not a bad thing for intellectual diversity to exist in the church. It is exactly what should exist. The church should be a place where ideas can be challenged. President Oakes, who you often quote, once stated that it is wrong to question church leadership even if the questioning or criticism is true. That was on the PBS documentary The Mormons in 2007. Any institution that tells you that certain beliefs, certain ideas, and certain leaders are beyond reproach, that they are not to be questioned, is not an institution you should trust with anything, because they are intentionally limiting your ability to push back, to question, to use the brain God gave you, because when you do so, it threatens the institutional authority of the church. For us to question racial teaching shows that the leadership can be wrong. And if the leadership can be wrong, then they cannot be trusted as people who will never lead you astray. That is why intellectual and ideological diversity is not only important. I believe that any God that is going to ask you to dedicate your time, your talents, and your everything else to any institution wants you to have the best possible information. And he wants you to be able to put every idea to scrutiny, because why would God want you to live in an existence where you dedicate your time, your talents, and your energies to an institution that will not subject itself or allow itself to be subject to your questioning? It's your life, and you only have a few short years on this earth. And to tell you that you cannot question and that you must obey is not about intelligence. It is about control.